The wheat had stopped growing 3 seasons ago. Margaret Reeves stood at the edge of the airstrip she'd carved from her grandfather's land, watching dust devils spiral across the cracked asphalt. The bank's foreclosure notice sat folded in her jacket pocket, edges worn soft from repeated handling. She'd been a Navy pilot once, call sign Harvest, before an incident over the South China Sea ended her career and sent her back to Nebraska with nothing but a Purple Heart and silence that followed her like a shadow. The airstrip had been her therapy, her memorial, her defiance against a world that had moved on without her. Every week she dragged the bush hog across the runway, clearing tumbleweeds that accumulated like accusations. Neighbors called her crazy. The county called her a liability. But Margaret maintained that strip of asphalt with military precision, painting fresh numbers every spring, checking the windsock daily, even though nothing had landed there in 7 years except memories. That October night, the temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour. Margaret was in the barn converting old aviation fuel when she heard it, not the sound itself, but the absence of sound, a pressure in the air that made her ears pop. She stepped outside and felt it in her chest before her eyes could adjust to the darkness. Something was displacing massive amounts of air above her property. The wheat field that bordered the runway began to flatten in geometric patterns, stalks bending outward from an invisible center. Then she saw it, a darker shape against the dark sky, angular and impossible, descending without engines screaming, without navigation lights, without any of the noise that should accompany 70 tons of aircraft approaching her unmarked civilian strip. The B-2 Spirit bomber touched down like a whisper made of composite materials and secrecy. Its landing gear kissed the asphalt Margaret had maintained for reasons she could never quite articulate to the bank's lawyers or her concerned sister. The aircraft rolled to a stop 300 feet from where she stood frozen, still holding a fuel can that suddenly felt absurd in her hands. She knew this aircraft. Every pilot knew this aircraft. Each one cost more than her entire county's annual budget. They operated from exactly 2 bases in the entire world. None of those bases were in Nebraska. None of those bases were foreclosed family farms with one middle-aged woman and a compulsion to keep runways clear. The canopy didn't open immediately. Margaret set down the fuel can with deliberate care, her training flooding back through neural pathways she'd thought were cauterized. She raised both hands slowly, fingers spread, making herself visible in the pale moonlight. The bomber's skin seemed to absorb illumination. A matte black that looked like television static had achieved physical form. Someone inside that cockpit had chosen this location deliberately. Someone had known this runway would be maintained, operational, and most importantly, off every official record. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. The canopy began to open with a hydraulic sigh that sounded obscenely loud in the Nebraska night. She couldn't see the pilot yet, just the soft red glow of cockpit instruments that seemed wrong somehow, flickering irregularly like a heartbeat under stress. Her own heart matched that rhythm. Whatever was happening, whatever had brought a strategic air command asset to her dying farm, it wasn't part of any training manual she'd memorized. The wheat continued to settle around the bomber's wings, and Margaret realized she was standing at the threshold of something that would either validate every strange decision she'd made since leaving the service or prove that everyone who'd called her broken was right all along. The pilot's helmet emerged first, reflective visor still down, anonymous. Margaret noticed the flight suit immediately, not the standard sage green, but something darker with patches she couldn't identify from this distance. The pilot moved slowly, carefully, the way someone moves when they're injured or when they're afraid sudden movements might trigger a response. Margaret kept her hands visible, her breathing controlled, falling into old protocols that felt simultaneously foreign and natural. The pilot's boots hit the asphalt with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. 2 steps, 3. Then the helmet came off and Margaret understood why her runway had been chosen. The woman facing her was young, maybe 28, with captain's bars that gleamed dully in the moonlight and blood running from her nose in a dark trail that had already dried partially. Her eyes held that thousand-yard stare Margaret remembered from her own mirror years ago. "Ma'am," the pilot said, voice steady despite the blood, despite whatever had happened. "I need you to listen very carefully. In approximately 18 minutes, people are going to arrive asking questions about what you've seen tonight. The correct answer is nothing. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, this runway was empty." She swayed slightly, caught herself. "But before they arrive, I need fuel, a landline that's not connected to internet, and your word that you understand exactly how serious this situation is." Margaret's hands were still raised, but her mind was categorizing details with the efficiency of her training. The blood pattern suggested rapid decompression or instrument impact. The timeline suggested the pilot had maybe 20 minutes of lead time on whoever was pursuing. The fact that she'd landed here, specifically here, suggested intelligence that went beyond simple GPS coordinates. "Lower your hands," the pilot said quietly. "You're Reeves, Margaret Reeves, call sign Harvest. I know who you are. That's why I'm here." The words hit Margaret like turbulence. Her call sign wasn't in any public records, had been stripped from official documentation after the inquiry. The only people who still knew it were people she hadn't spoken to in years, people who'd either died or disappeared into the classified world where careers go to either flourish or suffocate. "Who told you that name?" Margaret asked, lowering her hands slowly. The pilot reached into her flight suit with careful movements, withdrew a folded photograph, held it out. Margaret approached cautiously, took the photo, angled it toward the moonlight. Her breath caught. It was her, 20 years younger, standing in front of an FA-18 with 3 other pilots. She recognized everyone in the photo. 2 were dead. 1 had become an admiral. "Admiral Chen sends her regards," the pilot said. "And an apology. She said you'd understand when you saw the payload." She gestured toward the bomber behind her, its weapons bay doors still closed, but something about the aircraft's posture suggesting tremendous weight. "I'm Captain Torres, call sign Testament, and I just stole the most sensitive piece of technology currently in the U.S. arsenal. Admiral Chen helped me do it. Now we need your help to make sure it doesn't end up in the wrong hands." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of aviation fuel and autumn decay. Margaret looked from the photograph to Torres to the impossible aircraft sitting on her runway. 18 minutes, Torres had said, maybe less now. "The barn," Margaret said, making her decision with the same instinctive certainty that had once made her a good pilot. "Pull her into the barn, I'll get fuel, the phone's in the house." Torres shook her head. "The barn won't hide this. They'll have satellite coverage, thermal imaging, the works. This bird's already been cold for 90 minutes. The moment I power her up again, they'll know exactly where we are." She wiped blood from her upper lip with the back of her hand, a gesture that spoke of exhaustion beyond physical. "I didn't come here to hide, ma'am. I came here because what happens next needs a witness who can't be disappeared. Someone outside the system. Someone they already tried to erase once and failed." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a sensation like aircraft settling onto its landing gear after a difficult approach. For 7 years, she'd maintained this runway for reasons that felt more like compulsion than logic, dragging equipment across asphalt while neighbors whispered and banks foreclosed and life moved forward everywhere except on this specific strip of Nebraska land. "What's in the payload bay?" she asked. Torres smiled, and it was the saddest expression Margaret had ever seen on another pilot's face. "Proof," Torres said simply. "Proof that we've been lied to about what happened over the South China Sea. Proof about why your career ended. Proof that's going to burn down half the Pentagon if it reaches the right people." She glanced at her watch, a gesture that seemed almost casual except for the tension in her shoulders. 16 minutes now, maybe less. The question isn't whether they're coming. The question is whether you're ready to finish what you started 8 years ago, when you made a decision that cost you everything. The night air tasted like metal and electricity and possibility. Margaret thought about the foreclosure notice, about the neighbors who called her crazy, about the admiral who'd been her mentor before political necessity forced distance between them. She thought about the South China Sea, and what she'd seen in those final moments before her FA-18 had become unflyable, before the official story had been written, before silence had become her permanent duty station. "The phone's in the house," she repeated, but this time it wasn't a suggestion, it was a commitment. "And there's aviation fuel in the barn, not much, maybe 300 gallons. I kept it for reasons I couldn't explain to myself." She met Tor's eyes directly, pilot to pilot, and saw recognition there. "Tell me what you need. Tell me what happens when they get here. And tell me why Admiral Chen thinks I'm the person who needs to witness whatever comes next." Torres reached back into the cockpit, retrieved a tablet sealed in a waterproof case. "Because you were the first one who saw it. 8 years ago, over the South China Sea, you recorded something that shouldn't exist. The official report says you experienced equipment malfunction and spatial disorientation. But we both know that's not what happened." She held out the tablet. "The payload bay contains the wreckage of what you saw, wreckage that's been kept in a black site facility for nearly a decade. Wreckage that proves we're not alone up there and that senior military leadership has known and actively suppressed the truth." Her voice dropped lower, intimate and urgent. "Admiral Chen has spent 8 years building a coalition of people who believe the truth matters more than careers. Tonight was extraction night. The wreckage, the data, the proof, it's all in my payload bay. But the operation was compromised. Someone talked. I had maybe 40 minutes head start when I left Colorado. I'm down to 15 now, and when they arrive, they're going to make this runway and everything on it disappear. Unless there's a witness they can't touch." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she took the tablet. The screen was locked with a biometric scanner, but through the waterproof case she could see what looked like radar data frozen mid-frame. The trembling wasn't fear. It was recognition, muscle memory of the moment her instruments had stopped making sense, the moment the official story began diverging from reality. "They'll kill you," she said quietly. "The moment those people arrive, they'll kill you and probably me and say this was a tragic training accident." Torres nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth without flinching from it. "Probably. Unless enough people know the truth before they get here, that's where the phone comes in. You make 3 calls. First one to every news organization with an email address sending the files from this tablet. Second to Admiral Chen's personal line, the number's already programmed. Third to your sister, because someone in your family should know you weren't crazy. You were right." She paused, then added with something that might have been humor in different circumstances. "Then we wait and see if the truth is faster than a kill team." The absurdity and terrible logic of the plan hit Margaret simultaneously. Her runway, maintained for 7 years through obsession she'd never understood, was now the stage for either the greatest intelligence disclosure in history or a double murder that would be officially recorded as something mundane and forgettable. "Why not just send the files yourself?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Tor's smile confirmed it. "Because I'm compromised. My digital footprint is tracked, my communications are monitored. I wouldn't make it 3 sentences into an email before they'd have it blocked and traced. But you," she gestured at the farmhouse, at the isolation that had once felt like punishment. "You're a civilian. You're off-grid enough that they'll need physical assets to stop you, and those assets are still 14 minutes out if my calculations are correct. Which means you have maybe 12 minutes to upload everything, make those calls, and get this information distributed widely enough that it can't be contained." Her voice softened. "Admiral Chen was very specific. She said you were the only person she trusted with this, the only person who'd already paid the price for truth and might be willing to pay it again." Margaret looked at the B-2 sitting on her runway, a 70-ton monument to secrecy and national defense dollars, now repurposed as a delivery vehicle for the truth that had ended her career. She looked at Torres, bleeding and exhausted, and somehow still standing at attention in the way pilots do when everything's falling apart. She looked at the tablet in her hands, feeling the weight of data that was about to make her either a hero or a traitor depending entirely on which narrative reached critical mass first. The foreclosure notice in her pocket suddenly seemed irrelevant. They were going to take the land anyway. She might as well make it mean something. The house is 200 yards, she said, turning toward the structure. Stay with your aircraft. If they arrive while I'm uploading, get back in the air. Don't wait for me. Tors caught her arm gently. Ma'am, if they arrive while you're uploading, you need to keep uploading. Every second matters. Every file that reaches the outside world makes the truth harder to suppress. Her grip tightened slightly. Admiral Chen wanted me to tell you something else. She said to remember Hawaii. She said you'd understand. Hawaii. The word detonated in Margaret's memory with the force of ordnance. 2 weeks before the South China Sea incident, she and Chen had been at a conference in Honolulu, drinking Mai Tais on a hotel balcony while discussing the nature of duty and truth. Chen had been a captain then, brilliant and ascending, and she'd said something Margaret had never forgotten. When truth and duty conflict, choose truth. Duty without truth is just obedience, and history remembers obedience to lies unkindly. They'd laughed about it at the time, two young officers getting philosophical over tropical drinks, neither imagining how soon that principle would be tested. Margaret had chosen truth over the South China Sea. It had cost her everything. Chen had chosen duty, or so Margaret had believed, watching her mentor fade into the promotion track while Margaret herself faded into Nebraska obscurity. Now she understood. Chen hadn't chosen duty. She'd chosen the long game, the patient construction of this moment, using rank and position to eventually extract the truth that Margaret had been silenced for witnessing. I remember Hawaii, Margaret said, her voice steady. Tors released her arm. Then you understand why this matters, why tonight matters, why your runway matters. She stepped back toward the bomber, moving like someone whose body was running on willpower and training rather than physical reserves. 12 minutes, ma'am. Make them count. Margaret ran. She hadn't run in years, her knee still problematic from the ejection over the South China Sea. But she ran anyway because 12 minutes was simultaneously forever and no time at all. The farmhouse door slammed open under her shoulder, and she was moving through rooms that suddenly felt like tactical spaces rather than the site of her quiet exile. The computer was old desktop model that took precious seconds to boot. She forced herself to breathe, to think, to prioritize. The tablet connected to her USB port. Password was her old call sign, all caps, Harvest. The screen unlocked, and Margaret understood immediately why Tors had looked so exhausted, so haunted. The files were organized with brutal clarity. Radar data, recovered wreckage analysis, metallurgy reports that used elements that shouldn't exist in terrestrial technology, communications intercepts, witness testimonies, and most damning, a chain of emails showing exactly who knew what and when they'd decided to suppress it. She opened her email client, started composing. Every major news organization she could think of. Networks, papers, online investigative journalism outlets, foreign press services that might have more freedom to publish. The same email to all of them, files attached, subject line simple, UFO evidence suppressed by DoD primary source witness. Her finger hesitated over the send button. Once she clicked, there was no walking back. Her life would become public again, dissected and analyzed and probably destroyed in different ways than before. Outside, she could hear the faint sound of Tors moving around the bomber, probably doing final checks, preparing for whatever came next. Margaret clicked send. The progress bar crawled across the screen while her internet connection, satellite, slow, reliable, pushed compressed files into the digital atmosphere where they'd begin replicating across servers and inboxes and storage systems. 3%, 5%, 8%. She picked up the landline phone, dialed the number Tors had marked as Admiral Chen's personal line. It rang twice. This is Chen. The voice was older than Margaret remembered, carrying the weight of rank and years, but unmistakably her former mentor. Admiral, it's Harvest. Silence on the other end, stretching for 3 seconds that felt like tactical eternity. Margaret, is Testament with you? Yes, ma'am. We're uploading files now. 17% complete. How much time do we have? Chen's breath was audible across the connection. Less than you think. They activated a Special Activities Division team the moment Tors went dark. Tactical Response Unit, 6 operators authorized for terminal action. They diverted from Colorado 15 minutes ago. You have maybe 8 minutes before they're on site. Her voice shifted, became simultaneously more formal and more intimate. Margaret, I need you to understand something. What you're doing right now is treason by every legal definition that matters to the people coming for you. But it's also the only moral choice available. History will judge which definition matters more. I've made my peace with that. Have you? The upload bar hit 30%. Margaret watched it while considering Chen's question with the same analytical distance she'd once applied to combat decisions. Treason was a legal framework. Truth was a moral one. The two didn't always align. 8 years ago I saw something that shouldn't exist, she said quietly into the phone. I reported it honestly. The official response was to call me incompetent and end my career. If telling the truth once was worth losing everything, doing it again seems like consistency rather than treason. 45%. Admiral, whatever happens tonight, thank you for remembering Hawaii. Chen's voice caught slightly. I never forgot, Margaret. I just needed rank and time to make the memory actionable. Torres is the best pilot I've trained in 15 years. I sent her to you because if anyone could get the payload out and survive the landing, it was her. And I sent her to your runway because if anyone could be trusted to finish what we started, it was you. 60%. Through the window Margaret could see Torres standing beside the bomber, head tilted back, looking at stars that suddenly meant something different than they had an hour ago. The files are uploading, Margaret said. What happens after they're distributed? Chen was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could hear other voices in the background, the controlled chaos of an operation reaching critical phase. If enough files reach enough people before the team arrives, the truth becomes too distributed to suppress completely. There'll be an investigation, hearings, probably criminal charges for everyone involved, including me and you. But the information will be public, permanent, impossible to redact. Another pause. If the files don't finish uploading, or if they reach people who can be pressured into silence, then tonight becomes a tragic accident involving a stolen bomber, a disturbed former pilot, and national security threats that justify any measures taken. Your runway gets bulldozed, the wreckage gets recovered, and the official story holds for another generation. The upload hit 75%. Margaret, I need you to make me a promise. Chen's voice had shifted again, carrying the tone she'd used years ago when delivering difficult news to junior officers. If the team arrives before upload completes, you run. Don't try to defend the site. Don't try to protect Torres. Just run and survive long enough to tell the story yourself. You become the backup plan, the human evidence that can't be completely erased. 85%. And Torres? Margaret asked. Testament knows her mission priorities. She'll keep them occupied long enough for the upload to complete or for you to escape, whichever comes first, said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd made impossible decisions before. She volunteered for this knowing the odds. So did I when I authorized it. So did you 8 years ago when you filed an honest report about what you saw. We're all in this by choice, Margaret. That matters. 92%. Margaret heard something new in the distance, not close yet but approaching. A rhythmic percussion that her pilot's brain immediately identified. Helicopters, multiple aircraft flying fast and low. Torres heard it too. Through the window Margaret watched the younger pilot straighten, turn toward the sound, then look at the farmhouse. Even at this distance, even in darkness, Margaret felt the question in that gaze. 96%. The helicopters were definitely closer, coming from the northeast, flying without lights. Margaret did the math instinctively. 3 minutes to arrival, maybe 4 if they stopped to set up a perimeter. 98%. The phone was still connected to Chen. Admiral, they're here. How long? 3 minutes. Upload at 98%. Chen's voice became clipped, tactical. 2 minutes 30 seconds to full distribution. Can Testament buy you that time? Margaret looked out the window at Torres, at the bomber, at the runway she'd maintained through obsession and instinct. I don't know, she said honestly, but I think we're about to find out. 99%. The phone line went dead. Not disconnected but deliberately terminated, Chen removing herself from real-time liability. Smart. Margaret watched the final percentage tick to 100, then saw the confirmation. Files uploaded successfully. Distributed to 47 recipients. The moment crystallized, perfect and terrible. She'd done it. The truth was out, floating in digital space, landing in inboxes and server farms and journalist workstations across the world. What happened next would determine whether that truth survived long enough to matter. The helicopters were visible now, dark shapes against darker sky, descending toward her property with the precision of military assets that had made this exact approach in training hundreds of times. Margaret grabbed the phone again, dialed her sister's number. It went to voicemail. Of course it did. 2 in the morning on a Thursday. "Kelly, it's Margaret. I need you to listen. Tonight something happened on the farm. If you don't hear from me by morning, contact every news organization and tell them to check emails sent from my address in the last 10 minutes. Tell them the story is real, the evidence is genuine, and I died getting it to them. Tell them I wasn't crazy. I was right." She paused, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. "I love you. I'm sorry for all the years I was impossible, and thank you for never quite giving up on me even when you should have." She hung up. Through the window she watched the helicopters land, 3 of them forming a loose triangle around her property. 6 operators, Chen had said. They'd be deploying now, establishing fields of fire, securing the asset, preparing to neutralize threats. Margaret was a threat. So was Tors. So was the truth sitting in the bomber's payload bay. She walked out of the house without hurrying, hands visible, movements calm. Training from another life taking over. When captured is inevitable, control the encounter. Make yourself human, hard to kill without thought. Tors saw her emerge and shook her head slightly, a clear message. Get back inside. Margaret ignored it. The operators were approaching from 3 directions, visible now in tactical gear, weapons raised, moving with the fluid coordination of a unit that had worked together extensively. Night vision goggles turned their heads into insected silhouettes. On the ground. The command came from the northeast, amplified by equipment. "Both of you on the ground now, hands visible." Tors looked at Margaret one final time, and in that glance was an entire conversation about choices and consequences, and the strange mathematics of duty. Then the younger pilot raised her hands and began to kneel. Margaret did the same, the asphalt cold and rough against her knees, her hands laced behind her head in the position she'd been taught years ago in survival training. This was the position you assumed when capture was certain but execution wasn't. The operators converged quickly, professionally, weapons trained center mass. "Captain Tors, you're under arrest for theft of military assets, violation of national security protocols, and unauthorized disclosure of classified information." The voice belonged to a man Margaret couldn't see clearly behind the tactical gear. "Margaret Reeves, you're being detained as a person of interest in a matter of national security." Zip ties appeared, professional-grade restraints that cut into her wrists with practiced tightness. She was hauled to her feet, Tors beside her, both of them secured before anyone relaxed slightly. The team leader stepped forward, lifting his night vision goggles, revealing a face that was younger than Margaret expected and harder than she remembered human faces being. "Where are the files?" Direct question, no preamble. Tors smiled with blood still dried on her upper lip. "Check your email." The team leader's jaw tightened. He pulled out a satellite phone, stepped away, had a brief conversation that Margaret couldn't hear clearly. When he returned, his expression had shifted from professional calm to something colder. "Files are distributed. 47 recipients. Recall is impossible." He looked at Tors with something that might have been respect or might have been the acknowledgement one gives a condemned opponent. "You understand what this means for you?" Tors nodded slowly. "I do, but understanding consequences doesn't make choices wrong." The team leader turned to Margaret. "You uploaded the files. That makes you complicit in the largest security breach in U.S. intelligence history. You'll be charged under the Espionage Act. You're looking at life imprisonment minimum, execution maximum." Margaret met his eyes directly. "I was a Navy pilot. Call sign Harvest. 8 years ago, I filed an honest report about what I witnessed over the South China Sea. The official response was to destroy my career and call me incompetent. Tonight, I helped distribute proof that I was telling the truth. If that's espionage, then espionage and patriotism have become indistinguishable. The team leader studied her for a long moment. Behind him, other operators were approaching the bomber, beginning the technical work of securing sensitive technology and preparing it for transport. One of them was photographing everything, documentation for the inevitable inquiry. "You know what's in that payload bay?" the team leader asked quietly. "I know what I saw 8 years ago," Margaret replied. "And I know that truth got buried for reasons that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with institutional embarrassment." She leaned forward slightly despite the restraints. "How many of you have actually looked at the wreckage? How many have read the metallurgy reports? Or are you just following orders to contain information you've never been allowed to evaluate?" The question hung in the cold air. One of the other operators glanced toward the team leader, a brief look that suggested Margaret's words had found some target. The team leader's expression hardened. "My orders are clear. Secure the asset, detain all personnel, await transport for both the technology and the prisoners." He gestured toward the helicopters. "You're both going to a facility where you'll be held incommunicado while legal proceedings determine your fate. What happens after that depends on factors well above my pay grade." They were moving toward the helicopters, 2 operators per prisoner, when Torres spoke again. The files included witness testimony, 47 testimonies from military personnel who have encountered similar phenomena, pilots, radar operators, carrier crew, all of them suppressed, all of them threatened with prosecution if they spoke publicly. Her voice carried across the runway with surprising strength. Admiral Chen spent 8 years documenting a pattern of institutional denial. What you're suppressing isn't just wreckage, it's evidence that we've been lied to systematically about what's in our airspace, and evidence that good people have had their careers destroyed for telling the truth. The team leader stopped walking, turned back. "Captain, I'd advise you to stop talking." Torres smiled that sad smile again. "Why? The files are distributed, the truth is out. What I say now is just commentary." She looked up at the sky, at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the Nebraska darkness. "Every one of you has looked up at some point and wondered if we're alone. Tonight you're actively suppressing evidence that answers that question. How does that feel?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Margaret could see the operators processing Torres' words, training warring with curiosity, orders conflicting with the basic human desire to know. The team leader broke the moment. "Move them out, now." They were halfway to the helicopter when new lights appeared on the horizon. Not helicopter lights. Ground vehicles, approaching fast along the rural highway that bordered Margaret's property. 4 sets of headlights, moving with urgency but not the tactical stealth of the special activities team. The team leader cursed quietly, touching his comm unit. "Command, we have unidentified vehicles approaching the site. 4 vehicles, civilian configuration, possible media or local law enforcement. Advise." Static, then a voice Margaret couldn't hear clearly. The team leader's expression went from annoyed to professionally neutral. "Understood. Holding position." He turned to his team. "Secure the prisoners in the birds. Nobody talks to the civilians. This site is officially a training exercise area, temporarily restricted for national security reasons. Standard protocol." The vehicles were closer now, close enough that Margaret could see they were a mix. 2 news vans with satellite equipment visible on their roofs, 1 sedan that might have been law enforcement, 1 pickup truck that looked civilian. They stopped at the property line, just beyond the fence Margaret had stopped maintaining years ago. Doors opened. People emerged with cameras, recording equipment, notebooks. The first reporter, a woman in professional attire that looked absurd in the middle of a Nebraska field at 2:30 in the morning, raised a microphone. "This is Amanda Richardson, Channel 7 News. We're at a rural property outside Broken Bow where multiple sources report a military bomber made an emergency landing approximately 40 minutes ago. Can you confirm this is an active military operation?" The team leader approached the fence line, positioning himself between the reporters and the bomber. This is a restricted area involved in an ongoing training exercise. I'm going to need all of you to move back beyond the property line for your own safety. His voice carried command authority, the tone of someone used to being obeyed without question. But the reporters weren't moving. More vehicles were arriving, streaming down the rural highway with the speed of people who'd been scrambled by urgent tips. Margaret recognized the pattern. The uploaded files had included her location, the physical address where the bomber had landed. Every journalist who'd opened those emails in the last 20 minutes had seen the GPS coordinates. They weren't here by accident. They were here because the story had made arrival mandatory. Sir, we've received documentation suggesting this isn't a training exercise, but rather an unauthorized disclosure of classified UFO evidence. Another reporter, male, holding a tablet that probably contained the same files Margaret had distributed. Can you comment on allegations that the U.S. military has been suppressing evidence of non-terrestrial technology? The team leader's expression remained neutral, but Margaret saw the slight tension in his shoulders. This was spiraling beyond his mission parameters. I'm not authorized to comment on hypothetical scenarios. This is a restricted area. Anyone who remains beyond the property line after I've issued this warning is subject to arrest. But even as he spoke, more vehicles arrived. Local law enforcement now, the sheriff's department responding to reports of military activity on private property. The sheriff herself emerged, a woman in her 50s who Margaret recognized from town council meetings about the airstrip. Sheriff Dawson had been one of the voices suggesting Margaret's runway was dangerous, a liability, something that should be officially closed. Now she stood at the fence line, surveying the scene with the careful attention of someone trained to read situations. I'm going to need some explanation for military assets on private property without notification to local authorities, Dawson said, her tone professionally neutral but underlaid with steel. This is Margaret Reeves's land. She has rights here regardless of federal jurisdiction. The team leader turned to face this new complication. Sheriff, with respect, this is a federal matter involving national security assets. Local jurisdiction doesn't apply. Dawson smiled slightly. With respect, Deputy Director, federal jurisdiction on private land requires either permission or a warrant. Do you have either? The team leader's silence was answer enough. Margaret felt something shift in the tactical situation. What had been a clean containment operation was becoming complex, public, legally ambiguous. Torres, still restrained beside Margaret in the helicopter's cargo area, leaned close enough to whisper. Chen planned this. The files included the location to guarantee media response. She knew they'd come, knew it would make the suppression public, visible, impossible to deny. Margaret processed that information, understanding the multi-layered strategy. The truth was distributed in the files. But the act of suppressing that truth was now being documented by a dozen cameras, creating a second layer of story that would amplify the first. Brilliant and ruthless. The kind of strategy that required sacrificing pieces to achieve checkmate. She and Torres were the sacrifice pieces. The team leader was speaking into his comm unit again, longer conversation this time, clearly receiving new orders that complicated his original mission. When he turned back, his expression had shifted to something harder to read. New directive, he announced to his team. Secure the technology, document everything, prepare for transport. The two detainees will be transferred to federal custody pending investigation. All media inquiries are to be directed to the Pentagon press office. He looked toward the reporters. A statement will be issued within 6 hours addressing tonight's incident. Until then, no further information is available. Can you confirm the aircraft is a B-2 Spirit bomber? Richardson called out. Can you confirm Captain Torres is under arrest? Can you confirm the files being circulated contain legitimate classified material? The questions came rapid fire, overlapping, each one adding detail to the story that was being born in real time. The team leader ignored them all, turning back toward the bomber where his team was working. But Margaret noticed something new. The operators at the bomber weren't just documenting. They were looking inside the payload bay, actually examining what Tors had extracted. And their body language had changed. Less mechanical efficiency, more hesitation, the cautious movements of people encountering something that violated their understanding of the possible. One operator turned away from the payload bay, lifted his night vision goggles, looked back with an expression Margaret recognized. She'd worn that expression 8 years ago over the South China Sea. It was the face of someone whose worldview had just shattered, someone trying to reconcile training and orders with evidence that made both seem inadequate. Tors saw it too. "He's looking at the wreckage," she whispered, "seeing it for the first time without the filter of official briefings. Watch what happens now." What happened was subtle but significant. The operator who'd looked inside the payload bay moved to the team leader, spoke quietly, urgently. Margaret couldn't hear the conversation, but she watched the team leader's expression shift, watched him glance toward the payload bay, watched him make a decision. He approached the helicopter where Margaret and Tors were secured. "What exactly is in that payload bay?" he asked quietly, voice pitched below the range of the media cameras. Tors met his eyes directly. "The truth that cost her her career 8 years ago," she said, nodding toward Margaret. "Wreckage recovered from the South China Sea after an engagement with something that doesn't fit any known technology profile. Metallurgy that includes elements not found in Earth's crust. Propulsion systems that violate thermodynamics as we understand it. And documentation proving multiple senior officers knew about it and actively worked to suppress the evidence." The team leader was silent for a long moment. Margaret could see him processing military training war.